this video, did they jump or were they pushed? It's the name of a book. It's a book by Diego Gambetta. But I think it's much more than that. Though I like the title, I also think it's one of the key questions that we ask in education all the time. Were they pushed or did they jump? Gambetta's book is about adolescents in Italy deciding or not deciding to leave school and how they make that decision. But it crops up everywhere in education because we're interested in the extent to which people are agents of their own fate and the extent to which they are in the hands of forces that are outside them, forces that are beyond their control. And in general terms, we're interested in whether people have agency or whether it's structure, the structure of society, that shapes what they become. So the question is important in a general sense, and Gambetta's book looks at it in great detail in a specific case, as I say, the decisions that adolescents make about leaving school or staying in school when they come to the end of compulsory schooling. So this is the book, Did They Jump or Were They Pushed? And what Gambetta is going to do is set out the general problem that he is addressing. This is the passage where he sets the context of the research that he's doing. A surprising circumstance which emerges from reading through the studies of educational choices is that most authors have had the tendency to cluster around one of three approaches while ignoring or a priori rejecting others. He said that although lots of people have studied choices, generally speaking they have one idea in mind, either that people jump or they're pushed. And now Gambetta is going to address the question generally to answer which of those two is the case. Thus we find there are those who have stressed the importance of constraints, whether cultural or economic, those who have highlighted the role of subcultural values and experiences, those who have pointed out that it would be mainly a matter of rational decisions taken on the basis of costs and benefits, and finally those who have boldly insisted that there would be no hard evidence to prove that educational choices are other than the result of general preferences. Only a few authors have attempted some integrated tests. Perhaps the main controversy is between the cultural capital hypothesis and the rational choice hypothesis presented by Bourdieu and Boudon respectively. Okay, so Gambetta set the scene. The choices between cultural capital and rational choice. And those two camps are best represented, according to Gambetta, by Bourdieu on the one hand and Boudon on the other. So the cultural capital says if you've got parents, you come from a culture that is rich in connections, you understand education, you'll stay on in education, and if you're not rich in cultural capital, you will leave. That's one explanation. They were pushed. And the other explanation is people make a rational choice on the basis of costs and benefits as to whether they stay on at school or whether they leave. And that's the case that's made by Raymond Boudon. Now, Gambetta is taking those two broad camps and he is going to try to decide which of those two camps agrees more closely with the evidence that he can find from the decisions or the actions or the outcomes for Italian adolescents of school leaving age. And in order to do that, Gambetta is going to deploy an array of quantitative methods that will be able, he argues, to distinguish between the two camps, the two schools of thought. This is a decisive experimental testing of the question that we want the answer to. Now, he's going to now explain the method that he's going to choose. He's using a logit model. For the analysis of the survey data, I shall employ a non-linear model, the so-called logit model, a multivariate technique of analysis which allows the estimation of the effects of a set of independent variables upon the probability of making a given educational choice, maintaining the discreteness of the decision approximately as subjects encounter it in reality. The effects of all variables are considered simultaneously, thus the estimated coefficients associated with each variable measure the effect of the latter net of the effects of all other variables on the probability of making a given choice. Now, there's a number of important things here that Gambetta is saying. He's talking about the statistical quantitative method that he is going to employ, called the logit model, and he says that you put all of the variables into the equations at once, and the result is a solution that tells you which outcome is most probable given the circumstances, given the statistics that you've measured. And notice, at first glance, he seems to be claiming he can avoid the problem that I identified in the video about Gilbert Peaker. He doesn't have to decide which variables go in first, they all go in at once. So there's no question, or the implication is there's no question, that the outcomes are going to be shaped by the prejudices that are in Gambetta's mind when he starts the analysis. He goes on to say, as can be seen from the equations specifying the multinomial model, the odds of choosing, say, Liceo, that's the academic secondary school, relative to vocational school, are independent of the presence of alternatives other than Liceo or vocational school. In other words, estimating values in a multinomial logit model is equivalent to arriving at estimates for as many binary logit models as there are pairs of alternatives. The inference that Gambetta wants us to draw is that what he's doing is describing the decisions that young people make as they encounter them in reality. I think that's quite an important term. There is a judgment here being made about what the nature of the decisions are that face young people. What Gambetta tells us about the methods he's using is that it actually compares all of the possibilities that a person might choose two at a time. So if the choice is between grammar school, the academic school, or technical vocational school, it will tell us how much more likely one choice is than the other. At the same time, it will compare, for example, technical school with leaving school altogether, and it will compare the academic school with leaving school altogether. Those probabilities will be worked out for each pair of choices. Now, it's rather important to remember that those choices are not necessarily transitive. That's to say, just because a person who prefers academic school to vocational school and prefers vocational school to leaving school, it doesn't necessarily mean that they prefer academic school over leaving school. The logic of pairwise comparisons is slightly different, and it's not unproblematic, as we're going to see in that footnote to the previous section from Gambetta. This property, the property of comparing pairs of options, is known as the independence of irrelevant alternatives and is considered a disadvantage of the multinomial logit model. This is one of the reasons why some would prefer a multinomial probit analysis, which does not present this disadvantage. However, computational reasons have led others to look for ways to modify the multinomial logit model in order to mitigate the disadvantage of the assumption. One of these ways suggests the use of a hierarchical structure like the one that I have assumed, which consists of splitting the first 4 options into 2 steps. The first step, made of a binary choice with the options of staying on versus leaving, and the second concerning the choice among the 3 branches of high school. In this way, the problem raised by the independence of irrelevant alternatives can be avoided. In fact, in the first 2 steps, the alternatives are exhaustive of all possible behaviours, and therefore the problem does not arise. In the second step, it is reasonable to assume that the relative odds of choosing Liceo rather than vocational school, conditional of course on a prior decision to stay on at school, are independent of the presence of Instituto Técnico. Now, follow this carefully, because Gambetta is saying he's describing the choices as young people face them in real life, and he's suggesting that they make a decision in 2 stages. They first of all decide whether they're going to leave school or stay on at school. And then they're going to decide which kind of school they wish to stay on at, if they've decided to stay on. But does that seem likely? Does that seem plausible that a person says, I'm going to stay on at school, now let me see what kinds of school there are? Or does it seem more likely that the kinds of schools that are available and the kinds of choices that they're going to make about schooling are going to have an effect on their decision whether to stay on at school or not? And if you're in any doubt about that question, I strongly recommend that you have a look at a video, a TED Talk by Dan Ariely, that looks at how people make choices and whether their choices are influenced by irrelevant alternatives. Now let me stop there just for another second and say, if you've followed me through that rather difficult and heavy reading of Gambetta's technical details, just step back for a minute and have a general look at what you've just listened to. You've just listened to a discussion of the relative merits of at least 2 and possibly 3 quantitative methods. So if anybody tells you that there is a quantitative method and that's the end of the story, you should not believe them. There are many quantitative methods as there are many qualitative methods. And Gambetta, as an eminent scholar, is going to explain why he's chosen one quantitative method rather than another. And that decision, bear in mind, depends on a qualitative judgment about what the decisions are like that he's modelling, what he thinks is plausible, and what he thinks is likely to be going on in the heads of the people that he's looking at. All of those decisions are prior to putting the numbers in the equations. Quantitative methods don't get you away from discussing and being aware of the qualitative judgments that shape the way you can analyse the data and shape the conclusions that you can come to. Well, that's enough about method for the moment. Now let's come and look at the data that Gambetta is collecting. He's going to ask the young people who are facing the decision of leaving school or staying on at school a range of questions. And these include their attitudes towards the future and their expectations, and some details about their background. So Gambetta's asked these young people these things. What do you value? What value do you place on different aspects of your future work? How highly do you value earnings or status or success or career prospects or job security? Which of those things are, perhaps put them in order? Give us a hierarchy of what your values are. And it's also asked, what role will work have in terms of your future life? Is it going to be the most important thing in your life? Is it going to be important, but only important among other things like family life? What's your work-life balance going to be? Is work only important to survive? Or, I think the exact expression was, I have not thought about my future work closely enough to be able to specify this. So there's a range of questions here. Gambetta is asking his respondents to tell him in the present about the future. And he's also asking a number of other things. And in particular, he's asking about the social class background of the young people, the upper class, families where parents are senior managers and directors, managers in general, the middle class where the parents in the family are non-manual workers, salaried workers, the third category of self-employed that includes artisans and craftspeople, and the fourth category is working class people who are in manual work and who are not salaried but paid weekly. So that he's got this information about the social class background of the young people who are facing the choice of which school, whether to leave school or not, and which school to go to. And he's got this information about what their aspirations are. These are present statements about past heritage and present statements about future aspirations. And Gambetta has this to say. It does not seem plausible to believe that a working class father with a relatively higher level of education would have his children sent to school more frequently than a less educated one because he feels somehow higher up the social ladder and would feel a greater sense of demotion if he did not. It seems more plausible to believe that he would do so because generally less ignorant of the intrinsic and as well as the instrumental advantages of staying on at school for longer periods. It would, in other words, be more a matter of preferences than of cost-benefit calculation. What Gambetta is inviting us to do is to regard these things as measures of social capital, and therefore if these things influence the decision to stay on at school or not, that will mean that the person is pushed, and these things are indicators of rational choice, and therefore if these things influence the decision to stay on at school or leave, that will be an indicator that they jumped. But Gambetta confuses it a bit further than that by saying, let's suppose there's a differentiation between working class parents with a bit more or a bit less education. It doesn't seem likely, he says, that the working class father with more education would send his child to school more often because he thought it would be demeaning if he did not. He's saying that the working class parent who has more education is more likely better informed about earnings, status and success, and therefore is able to make a better rational decision. But then how does that work? How do we then differentiate between whether someone is pushed or whether someone jumps? I think it's probably at this point a good moment to look at Gambetta's conclusion. And what he has to say is this: we are finally in a position to amend the overall model elaborated above and sum up our theoretical conclusions. So were they pushed or did they jump? If anything, they jumped. They jumped as much as they could and as much as they perceived it was worth jumping. The trouble, though, is that not all children can jump to the same extent, and the number of pushes they receive in several directions, shaping their opportunities as well as their preferences, varies tremendously in society. What does not seem to vary is that the pushes are likely to push in the wrong direction. Wrong in general because of the strong degree of social inequality involved, but wrong in particular too because several of those who are pushed upwards risk failures later on and are often in no position to make good use of the education that they receive, other than for satisfying tenacious family pride, and because some of the others, those who are pushed downwards and do not simultaneously enjoy the relaxing gift of self-deception, are left wondering whether they could not have made a better job of it had they been given a better chance. So at the end of all the numerical, quantitative calculations, the sophisticated formula, sophisticated methods, Gambetta leaves us with the conclusion that they jumped, here they are, they made rational decisions, but they made rational decisions that were shaped by and governed by the pushes that they got and the limitations that were placed on them. In the end, Gambetta doesn't separate out, is unable to separate out the difference between whether they jumped and whether they pushed. And you should not be too surprised about that, remembering that all of these variables went into the equations at the same time and with the same status. Everything is in the interpretation. And that brings me back to reflect on this overall, the limitations which are on this kind of study. What have we seen here? We've seen Gambetta trying to use a quantitative method in order to explain the difference between being pushed and jumping in an educational decision. But before he could use the quantitative methods, there was a lot of qualitative work went into framing the question, framing the data that he was going to collect, and deciding what was a plausible description of the choices being made. And coming out at the end of the quantitative analysis, there's again a lot of interpretation as to what means being pushed and what means jumping. So that the quantitative and the qualitative aspects are inseparable. And more importantly, in the course of presenting his case, Gambetta introduced not one, but 3 or 4 quantitative methods. What all of this means in a broad sense is that if anybody ever tells you that there are 2 methods, there is a quantitative method and there is a qualitative method, then either they don't know what they're talking about, or they're deliberately setting out to insult your intelligence, or both. Anyone who simplifies things down to quantitative and qualitative, and worse still, if they suggest that if you're so flaky you can't decide between the 2, you better use mixed methods and get the best of both worlds, they simply haven't understood the philosophical underpinnings that you need to dig into if you're going to have a sound foundation for your methods, whether they're quantitative or qualitative. For the future, this is a technique that's failed. I think that we've seen with Pika earlier, the techniques that are being used have failed in separating out the different influences on people when they come to a parting of the ways in their educational careers. And what I think for the future we need to look at is ways of modelling more precisely methods that match the nature of the choices that are being made. And I think there are some options there for us to model choices, in Gambetta's terms, more closely to reality, but I'm not sure I like that expression either. But ways of encapsulating our intuitions about choices in appropriate methods.